Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When I was growing up, just after dinosaurs stopped roaming the earth, we had 7 major English language daily papers in New York City and 7 over-the-air television stations. While they differed in their partisan leanings, they all by and large agreed on the basic facts of public issues that were the subject of public debate. That is no longer the case. The latest studies by the Pew Trust and others, which asked where people often get their news, found 18% said newspapers, 25% said radio, and 50% said television. The fastest growing source for news is online or digital sources, especially for college students who tell pollsters they get their news from networking sites such as Facebook or Instagram. 43% of respondents to Pew cited digital sources, almost as many as cite television as the primary source for news. The explosion in the number of online journalistic outlets has in fact launched 1,000 ships, many of them giving what some call citizen journalists access to potentially wide audiences that would never have existed when traditional media served as a gatekeeper of who and what merited that wider exposure. But those 1,000 ships also mean that the media universe is so fragmented, and that fragmentation is so often ideological and partisan that public policy experts have developed the term wicked problems to refer to debates where key players can't or won't even agree about what the facts are. And this problem would exist even without the man in the White House screaming about fake news and calling reporters enemies of the people. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers who work in and around the news media and are part of the discussion over where we have come from, where we are going, and whether consensus is even possible in the face of that fragmentation. Arce, who has been a reporter for print, blogs, and podcasts, was just hired to write a daily newsletter for the New York Times, which is an English language broadsheet on Manhattan's West Side. Jere Hester is an old daily news colleague of mine who just left CUNY's journalism school to head up The City, which is trying to provide the basic local news coverage that cash-strapped mainstream newspapers cannot or will no longer do. Rose Arce is a former Newsday colleague of mine and a former producer at CNN, and she is executive producer for Starfish Media, the news organization headed by veteran and award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien. And Jennifer Fermino is a veteran reporter who now is communications director for City Council Speaker Corey Johnson and has to fence daily with many of the online outlets. We're taping this on the day that we found out about the pipe bombs at CNN, at George Soros's house, at Hillary Clinton's house, aimed at Barack Obama. And Jen, let me ask you, because you were at City Hall as this was going on. You know, we're talking about how the partisans in the media and partisans using the media retreat to echo chambers, and that kind of feeds some of this. You know, does that in fact feed what we saw happen today?
I know that, you know, it was when we got the news that this happened, obviously we were very careful about what we said because a lot of people, you know, are looking to city government to, you know, are looking for officials to know what's going on. And so we immediately, through Twitter, which was how we put out our first statement, which is sort of a relatively new, as you know, as someone who worked in
now
city.
A major news source.
Yeah, so
right.
Like our first statement came on Twitter, and it was really just to be informative and to let people know what was going on. And even though we didn't know what was going on, we just told about some street closures, said be safe, call this number. But I did notice that right away, I mean, really early, people were calling it false flags and maybe suggesting that this was something that people on the left were doing to drum up sympathy. And then there were immediate people on the left who were hitting back at that. People started fighting like right away over what actually had happened. And nobody knew what happened at that point. We still don't know.
Jere, you spent a lot of years at the Daily News. Can't be more kind of traditional news than that. You've just spent years teaching journalism students at CUNY, and now you're part of the group starting up The City, which is trying to establish that there is a common set of facts. When you see people doing analysis before you even know the facts, whether it's, you know, leftists drawing links, which turned out to be accurate in this case, or right-wingers putting up claims of false flags, what does that tell you about the journalism environment?
It tells us that there are folks out there in media and beyond the media who are going to kind of fill the gaps of what we don't know with speculation, and that's where we get into dangerous territory.
Ozzy, you've done podcasts, you've done online stuff, you've done weeklies, you're now at the Times. When this stuff comes in at you, I mean, you've been doing a lot of political reporting for the last decade. You know, I've been accused of trying to exploit reporters for political purposes myself, even then I was a political reporter.
Right.
And how do you see all this coming out?
No one specific incident can be tied to a direct statement by any kind of politician. I think most people try to avoid those kind of direct connections, but there is something about patterns over time. And one of the things that you've seen recently is the president and other people sort of not just criticize reporting in the media, but attempt to delegitimize it. And when you talk to law enforcement officials, they generally speak in sweeping tones about tenor and atmosphere, and there's a notion that the temperature can be turned up or down based on the way people behave in public. And I think when you see a president referred to reporters, not just that he disagrees with them, but that they're enemy of the people, others who are perhaps have other issues and problems in their own lives with mental health and other issues may take signals from those statements and act in a way that is not intended, which is to sort of retaliate physically, and people may get the equation that it's a tit for tat. If this is an enemy of the people, what I'm doing is justified. So people who are more conscientious about their presence in the public often are cognizant that they're limited in what they can say because other people may pick up on what they say in unintended ways and do things that can harm not just a specific person, but institutions and the entire sort of conversation that we try to have in public.
Rose, we've talked about this, about how to some degree the media beast thrives somewhat on this polarization and this fragmentation.
Absolutely, it draws attention. And I think we're in this sad little state where I think the media is pretending a little bit that Donald Trump became president and suddenly the facts didn't matter and suddenly there was mistrust in the media. And I think this is something that really predates him. The stage was set for this. This is not something that happened by accident. We had decades and decades of a media that didn't really represent the people. I think we bear a lot of responsibility here. The media was predominantly white. It was somewhat monolithic in the way it viewed people. It wasn't diverse either in its opinions or its perspective or its context. And I think that social media became this opportunity for people to look around, for people who looked like them and people who thought like them and people who appreciated them. So I do think we bear an enormous amount of responsibility for the fragmentation that's happened.
But everybody just, jump into this, would jump into this discussion. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said you're allowed to have your own opinions, you're not allowed to have your own facts.
Yeah, I think we have an issue not only in New York, one of the media capitals of the world, certainly the media capital of this country, where we're looking at, what's virtually a local news desert. I think that problem's exacerbated across the country, and I think there's been a disconnect where people don't see their lives reflected in the news. And I think everything that Rose says is true, but I would add to that all what she says was happening at the same time that we've got a shrinkage of the media, especially the local media.
I mean, you have to deal with this. The New York Times has more people in Brussels than it has in Brooklyn or the Bronx. The Daily News, where you and I worked, had robust bureaus in the boroughs, and they don't exist anymore.
It's very true. I mean, there's many, many things that go on in the New York City that don't really get the type of scrutiny that they should, or there's just.
But what about the
changes.
online outlets and the weeklies? I mean, are there people trying to fill that vacuum?
I know that I don't really see on the real local. I mean, I know the city is, everybody's really excited about that. But I mean, in terms of the actual council, I think DNA Info was a big loss, the loss of the Daily News bureaus, the, borough bureaus. The Post, the news and the Post are still there, and they do cover, local things. But I don't know, it's not as much, I don't think, and I say this as someone who works at the city council, I don't think there's as much scrutiny of what's going on, and I think that debate, and when I say scrutiny, I think it's a really healthy thing. I think it helps the elected officials. I think it helps New Yorkers to really have a spotlight of just somebody who's really looking at these things.
Yeah, and to sort of expand on that point, people know better who follows them online than who follows them into an elevator and lives on their floor. A lot of people are living these lives digitally on their phones. I mean, if you just count the number of times you look on your phone rather than you look someone in the eye in any given day, there's a digital dimension to people's lives that didn't exist before, and I think that sort of contributes to people's attention going elsewhere. Now, the positive side of that is that people in New York are sort of expected to not only be aware if there's an earthquake in Mexico or a tsunami in Japan or a crisis somewhere in Darfur or another place that is not immediately in front of them. We're all interconnected, and we're supposed to be knowledgeable and aware and sensitive and act on that in a global sense, but that has taken away from the bandwidth that we have to give to our immediate areas.
But there's also the point that fragmentation is ideological and it's partisan, and it's that vacuum is being filled with through an ideological prism.
But I think you need to also take into account that new media is actually less diverse than traditional media. So it's not like we have all these new outlets and they're much more representative of the people. They're actually less representative of the people.
In what sense? I mean,
which is why I think that people are still turning to things that mirror their point of view. I mean, for instance, let's take police brutality. The police didn't just begin shooting and beating up black people. This has been happening for a long, long time, and it wasn't being reported on. So now you have cell phone videos, and they get posted on Twitter, and they get posted on Facebook, and so people now have a place to go. And the same thing that's happening on the right is happening on the left. People are looking for people that are hearing their voice.
So, I mean, does that, go ahead.
Well, I would say yes, and I think that it is where people are getting the news, but there's no editors to what you see, so
That's right.
sometimes what you're seeing is not a whole video, or like there was this video of the Proud Boys that came out over the weekend, and it started getting, right away you saw it on Twitter, and it was not the entire video. It just picked up at a point where they were beating up someone, and then like 3 days later, the NYPD released like a longer version of it, and it was a little more of a
It was
fight.
a little more nuanced.
It was,
Yeah.
it was a little more of a fight between the protesters and the Proud Boys. Not to say that they're similar, but people who protest and the Proud Boys are not the same as this hate group. But the situation of how it happened, of how the fight actually started, looked a lot different when the whole video came out. And so people are getting their news, and it's to have an editor, to somebody who's going to say, I need to see the whole video before we're going to do a story on this. But the problem now is, even news isn't waiting for the whole video. They're just sort of like a video was posted. So much of even what you get in the newspapers, they don't have the luxury of waiting because they know that people are already seeing it. And so they're going to put something in the newspaper that's really only half the story or potentially half the story. So there's so much has changed with newspapers in terms of people getting their news from social media, people getting it unfiltered, and the newspapers rushing to
do it online.
Right. And also the cuts to newsrooms where they don't have. When I started the Daily News, there was 4
editors.
people in covering City Hall. There's now 1. That's a huge change.
And
That's
in a
only
sense,
4 years ago.
Everybody's become CNN too. Everybody's doing breaking news. Now you get breaking news alerts from the New York Times and New York One
Right.
and the Daily News. Everybody wants to be first with stuff,
Yes.
even though there's yet no context, no facts, no nuance. They don't know the whole picture. They have maybe one soundbite that somebody sent
Yes.
out that now everybody subscribes to everybody else, so you can use each other's material.
So, reporting used to be journalism used to be the race to report, and now now you have to be the first to confirm. And I think that difference sort of gets lost on a lot of people. And secondly, the point that Rose and Jennifer are making really well is that we're sort of drowning in content and we're starving for context. And I think there is a role that reporters play as a gatekeeper in a sense of filtering information, getting it, aggregating it, understanding it, and then putting out the best sense of the truth that you can acquire as quickly as possible. But if you go back and remember when a sitting president was sort of forced to release his long-form birth certificate to dispel a rumor that was propagated, without good faith by many actors, you sort
including the current president of the United States.
You saw that the gatekeeper function of what you can keep out as a rumor from the mainstream media was sort of lost. Now, there were many people who were amplifying that kind of message for different reasons, but when you saw Obama sort of release that sort of marked a moment when journalism had to sort of adjust how they reflected information that they were hearing but didn't think it was worth attention if other people were sort of circulating it in emails or now in social media?
No, well, the media is very hesitant to call a lie a lie. I mean, it's sort of a new
Yes.
phenomenon that they're actually trying to do that. And I think the other word that they don't want to use is racist. You know, you have people saying extremely racist stuff, and they won't call it what it is. There's all this sort of, you know, mushy language around it, and did the president really say that, and what did it mean, and they won't call it what it is. You know, Ann Coulter is a racist. You know, why, and I ask, why are people still publishing her? You know?
Ann Coulter's a very good one to ask about.
Yeah.
Jere, you've been teaching students. Are the values of journalism different?
I don't, at their base, no, they shouldn't be. You know,
Medium is different.
the medium is different, delivery system is different, the audience is different in a lot of ways.
The audience
now.
is fragmented. I mean,
The audience can be fragmented. You know, I think, you know, in terms of what Ozzy was describing, and a lot of what now is playing a game of whack-a-mole, right? As things pop up, you're addressing them, becomes very reactive rather than proactive. And that's taking a lot of time, it's taking a lot of resources, where, especially in local news, the staffs are shrinking to begin with. So kind of a lot of the day-to-day, the decision-making that goes on in government and other halls of power doesn't get the scrutiny that it should, doesn't get the scrutiny that it used to.
let me ask you, just to do a little bit of advertising for you, which we have not talked about. I mean, what's the idea of the city? The idea of the city is in part, I don't know if it's to fill the vacuum or to recreate something. I mean, what is the idea? Because I think it's very important. I agree with Jennifer.
Yeah, I think it's part of all that, right? In terms of recreate.
And the city is going to be creating a new, in essence, news bureau covering New York City. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely. You know, in terms of the recreation, we're going to be covering some of the news that doesn't get covered anymore. We're going to be doing it in a digital forum. You know, the idea is to go and fill some of the gaps, but we also want to do it in a way that's built for the digital mobile audience, so that when people are finding things on Twitter or on Facebook, hopefully they're finding some of our stories among there. We're talking about, bad players going and filling the gaps, and I think we have an issue with folks either not paying attention to the source of news before, not caring about where the source of where it's coming from. I think some of that has been, again, aided and abetted by the president, but not this predated him, in terms of this lack of trust, in terms of people looking at the news, not necessarily seeing not only their views not reflected, but their lives not reflected. And I think that's a bigger disconnect, and I think that kind of feeds kind of the partisan state that we're in.
Rose, you talked about how, if you have Fox News on the right and you have kind of MSNBC on the left, and people are retreating to their corners in a boxing match. CNN is there to play things down the middle. And, so are they forcing an equality of ideas? I happen to think, I'm a progressive guy, I happen to think that sin falls much more strongly on the right side of the political agenda than it does on the left. But I'm aware, I was a reporter long enough, I'm aware that that's a biased view. I mean, is there a middle ground?
Well, I think that CNN is facing the same challenge that all the media is facing, which is they need to answer the question of whether Trump has redefined the middle. Whether we now, because the president is over here, does that mean that the middle moves over here? Does that mean that because he says he's a nationalist, that means that white nationalists are now the right and therefore they have a platform in mainstream media? I would say not. I'd say that there are some ideas that don't necessarily get a platform. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom to have a platform on a major media organization. They don't have to put everybody on. Every opinion is
But yet there are
valid.
platforms, because of the fragmentation, because of the citizen journalists, because of the power of the net to kind of create your own realities. There are all these multiplicity. That's as you said. That's the positive side. Even though I think there's something very negative for society at large, there's a real positive side in not having the gatekeepers.
There is, it's what you were saying about how people weren't seeing diversity in, like people weren't seeing their lives, it wasn't diverse, like the gatekeepers weren't. Like in the gatekeepers, they serve a role in that they'll cut out like things that like are incomplete or you don't understand, or like maybe a misleading video or something that like isn't fully reported. Like you do kind of need an editor to go, I have a million questions about this. Like we're not going to tell people about this when it's inflammatory on its own. So that's a good thing that an editor can do, or a gatekeeper, a producer. But then the problem is they're not diverse. So sometimes they're like pushing things down that actually should be pursued. So it's really complicated.
I think one of the issues that we're all sort of like dancing around is that the economic model for journalism is severely challenged, and that's part of the reason why you don't see the kind of diversity that Rose is talking about. And it's why, as Jerry's saying, news organizations are playing whack-a-mole, is because a lot of times they're chasing, they're in a race to get clicks, because clicks drive traffic, and that is
Traffic
what
has ads, yeah.
and exactly. So if you have a subscription-based model, if you have a paywall, if you have foundation funding, those influence the kind of resources an editor can put into a story, and then that can also help decide, an editor and a reporter determine whether or not you chase a story, whether or not you hold back, or whether or not you have to throw everything in, because the next person and the next organization is going to chase after it. And one of the things that's competing for attention isn't just news, but it's also any kind of content creator. It's Netflix, which now you can get on your phone and watch TV.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're
That's the content we create. Absolutely.
Exactly. So the content we create, which is created by ourselves, and the people that we cover, from Donald Trump all the way down to Corey Johnson, are in some sense competitors for attention, because they have Twitter feeds that news organizations also have. So they're a source for information, but they could also break news ahead of us, before us. So there's a lot of different dimensions to how you sort of gather people's attention for an audience. And if your economic model is based on having the biggest audience, that's going to lead you to the kind of editorial decisions that Jerry and others have spoken about.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other thing is that you have so many more ways to check out, as you're saying. So many, and you have a huge middle of the population that is effectively checking out, and you have the extremes engaging more than ever before.
But are they checking out, or are they going to where they're comfortable, as opposed to the idea of mass communications? The idea of broadcasting was that it was going to be broad. The idea of a newspaper is that it was going to be a unifying force in a community. Now you have, in essence, narrowcasting.
Bob, by retreating to where you're comfortable, that is a form of checking out.
Yes.
Yes, it is. And I think that there's a social cost to that. Rose and I worked at New York Newsday, and we had a rather legendary editor named Don Forst, who said that he doesn't give a damn about hockey, but if there's 10,000 people who cared about hockey, and then there was 15,000 people who cared about this, and there was 5,000 people, that you throw it all together into one. But now you don't. But this idea of broadcasting, or a broad, a presentation of everything in one place. Is this an anachronism? Am I pining for something that doesn't exist?
Well, that's where you'd have the economic realities that come in. That if you can find something that you feel like appeals to like a base that's going to buy your product or get your newspaper, then I think people are really like your clicks. And that's very immediate. Like what stories people are clicking on, and they're often not. They're often not the ones that you want them to click on. They're often like, something about Justin Bieber or something. You know what I mean? Like, and yet you're a New York Daily. What do you do?
Well, but is it, you can't always get what you want, but you might get what you need? Is there a point at which you want people to be aware? Do you want to force people? Is there any way to force people out of their comfort zones, to confront something beyond their own comfort zone? Or am I just being, Pollyanna-ish?
Yeah. Pollyanna is a good word for that.
Look, I think that, with everything being so niche now, there really is a lot of siloing going on and people retreating. And in some ways, personalization of news is great, because you can get the information that you need to run your life. The problem is we all start living in our own silos. That's where we have not just a journalism program, we have a problem, we have a democracy problem.
That's right, I agree with that.
I think there needs to be a search in journalism for common ground. I mentioned before people seeing stories that reflect their lives. That's part of it. I think also there's a need and hopefully a thirst for people wanting to know what's going on around them that may be affecting other people. Like Ozzy says, if we're all kind of living on our own world, and some of that is either enhanced or abated by digital means, I think there needs to be a clarity in storytelling and helping people see information that they need to run their lives, to be good citizens.
I think there are things the media can do also. I don't think this is a hopeless situation. I think, for one thing, we need to, yeah, right. Thank you for a little optimism. The media needs to stop chasing ambulances and Twitter lines and chasing everything that Trump says.
Ambulances might be actually a story, but I
exactly.
agree with the Twitter
But we need to calm down and start covering more of the things that people care about. I mean, there are enormous issues out there that are affecting people's lives every day that the media doesn't even blink at. I mean, look at climate change. How many stories are there about climate change? We have, tornadoes and hurricanes and typhoons and tsunamis and killing people all over the place. And we do story upon story about Hurricane Florence, and we don't talk about climate change.
But we used to cover community boards
Yeah,
all
absolutely,
over the city.
Yeah.
And
there would be great stories from community
Oh, there's
boards.
great
I
stories.
remember when DNA Info started, that was sort of their thing that they, and I was at the New York Post then, and they had somebody in they had assigned
community.
reporters, and they were going to community boards, and they were getting great stories. And
which then the mainstream
which
media
then
would
everybody
steal
was picking up. And then there was a period.
right.
So then I started going to community boards, and I can tell you, I can think of 2 stories I got that were really, really good because the community
Absolutely.
boards,
And
One
the
of the
worst
other great sources of stories is when the council has a stated meeting. The stated meeting is when the city, that's what it's called, when the city council meets. And they have an agenda where all the members introduce their resolutions. And there's some very bizarre ones. There's a lot of good stories just in what people are. I used to get a lot of stories out of that agenda, which, some of them never went anywhere, but at least you could, if you could make fun of a council member, you could always get it in the paper.
Yeah, and I was going to add on the TV side, what is really killing things is that the cable stations have stopped reporting news. They just have talking heads.
Yeah.
It's an absolute echo chamber.
This is right.
And CNN is one of the worst. My former
a big
employer, it's they
problem.
stopped doing stories.
Well, we're getting analysis and we're not getting reporting.
That's
We're
right.
getting analysis before the reporting.
there are
I
no
actually
new
think
facts.
even at Fox News, you look at their daytime lineup, there's some very good reporters
Yes.
who are doing, who are very straight reporters. I mean, you have the kind of right-wing blogging, the right-wing universe that's there in prime time at night, but I think there's a very broad brush that they're painted with, and they have some excellent reporters. And the same thing with MSNBC. I mean, I may be more comfortable with their political bias, but you look at during the day in the straight news coverage, there is still a lot of straight coverage, but not on a local level. And that's what a lot of people who care about this city in particular, this is a city with great struggle, that journalism can put highlights on that struggle, like what the Daily News has been doing about the New York City Housing Authority, what they've been doing
9/11,
about
the big issue
about
with
the
9/11
about
benefits,
the 9/11
the
health
kid.
benefits. There's something that, frankly, that a newspaper can do that even a TV station can't do, because I always said you can't put a videotape on your refrigerator and keep it. There's some particular power of print.
Look, there's a lot of great work being done. Examples you mentioned in the Daily News, very good stories every day on New York One, in the Post, in the Times. The problem is that we're not getting the volume that we used to, and we're not getting necessarily the consistency.
You don't have the staff.
You don't have the staff, and you're not getting the consistency of the coverage in the sense that, with exceptions with the news and NYCHA aside, that folks are focusing on issues and they're staying on them. And the staying on them is the important part, because that's how you affect change.
This is a very naive question I'm about to ask. I'm going to ask you, and I want everybody to reflect on it, because you've just been dealing with aspiring journalists for a long. Are people going into journalism because they want to tell a story, or because they want to change the world?
I think they want to do both, and I think they want to change the world through telling a story. I can say, coming out of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, that the last 2 years we've had record number of applications. We've had our biggest class ever, and this all is post November 2016. I think with a lot of young journalists.
Well, there was also after Watergate, there was this huge.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Right,
In
right.
terms of
Of national crisis.
right. In terms of that, from I was a kid during that, but it was one of the things that inspired me. I know there's a whole generation that came out of Woodward and Bernstein. I think we're seeing something similar now. I also think that young people see an opportunity amid all this disruption and all this change. They know there's something going on here. It's not quite formed yet, but they want to be part of it and they want to shape it. And I'm thrilled by that.
I mean, how do they support themselves? So,
Yeah, which is the big question, because the number of people falling out of journalism after they've graduated from school is unbelievable, and particularly among minorities.
I
The
used
odds
to
of a
teach
Latino
at
staying
I
in
used to teach at
journalism?
the Columbia Journalism School, where people were paying in those days $45,000 a year for a $30,000 a year entry level
Job, yeah.
journalism job, and so you weren't exactly going to get the kind of diversity you're talking about because you needed people who could afford to go to the schools.
Yeah.
So, do you see, when you are called by all these online outlets, whether whether the people who are writing for Gotham Gazette, for City Limits, for all the kind of multiplicity of websites, do you find them more ideological than, pardon the expression, the kind of straight reporters that we grew up as?
Not really, but I would say because of what the council does, we just intrinsically are the most local, of government. We had the Small Business Job Survival Act, a hearing on
Commercial,
that.
the commercial rent control.
It's not commercial rent control, but it's
right,
like
but
we call it.
that's how it was portrayed. Right.
But so we had a hearing on that, and we had it was really nice. I mean, there was a lot of, but it wasn't. And to what you said of people staying on it, there was a very small group of people. I mean, this has been around. This hearing's been coming. A lot of people came to the hearing, but there was really, I can only think of 2 reporters, that's maybe 3 or 4, that were in the weeks prior to the hearing, constantly
Focused on it.
focused on it, asking a lot of questions, who's going to testify, and so you have the day where it's like the big splash, but as you rightly said, journalism is really about sticking on something, and I think that's what you see with the Daily News' NYCHA. I mean, NYCHA now is the biggest, it's on everybody's radar, but it's been on Greg Smith, the Daily News reporter, he has been writing about it since Bloomberg was mayor,
And he's doing it, and he's basically
and
doing
this is
it-
why he now is at the top of his game, and this is why now the city is paying attention to it, really.
But it's also a document story. It's he's
Yes,
he's
yes.
He's doing it off of documents. He's not telling you something. He's showing you something.
Yes.
He's not finding people who are just saying something, but he's done the work to get the documents to kind of back up. It's rule to me. Rule 101 is don't tell me, show me. Back up what it is you want to do.
And one of the amazing things about NYCHA is that if we go back in history of New
I
York
grew up
City,
in NYCHA, so I'm particularly
Right.
interested.
Well-
I grew up
well-
in Linden Houses in East New York.
one of the people who helped shape NYCHA, for better or for worse, was Robert Moses, who was sort of doing a lot of urban renewal, as they were calling it, and moving people around New York City. When New York City had many more reporters and journalists and newspapers active at that time, except the sort of protocol for journalism back when he was sort of ascending power was to sort of take what government said and not question it. And now, oddly enough, you have a smaller sort of footprint for journalism, but much more
Aggressive.
of a cynical, shall we say, relationship between an official government story and what reporters sort of put into the paper. There's a trust but verify element, whereas when Robert Moses was starting and moving people around, people didn't even question it. So I think the story of NYCHA is an amazing story about human suffering, about bureaucracy sort of falling in place, but it's also, if you look back long enough, it's about journalism sort of realizing
Right, but
its
first
power.
of all, I think that there's a difference between being cynical and being skeptical. I always,
Better-
I always
much better.
right. I mean, I think you should be skeptical.
always need an
worry
editor,
about
so
you.
thank you.
I always worry about people being cynical. But you also had reporters in those days. You had a much more competitive journalistic universe.
Yes.
You had 7 papers. If you throw in Spanish language papers, Italian language papers, Yiddish papers, Chinese papers. Out where I live, we had the Long Island Press and the Long Island Star. You had an amazing array of papers, and that was very competitive. And city officials could play one off against the other, and that competition. It's a very messy process.
But there's still a high
It's
level
not a
of
clean,
competition.
linear process, but that's how that's how everything gets pushed down the field.
I think the thing is that the competition has changed, though. It's not the traditional competition. Now we're competing, as you said, with Netflix for attention, but also with Facebook for news, and rumors for news, and the rumor mill and the Twitterverse for news.
Yeah, but it's also the case that, for instance, I worked at the Daily News. I loved the Daily News. I loved when the Daily News does these, massive campaigns on housing, and they've done it on a whole range of issues, a lot of health issues. They did it on asthma.
Transportation.
They did it
Yeah.
on transportation.
Boulevard of death.
But to me, as a public school parent, they also treat the school system as the sixth crime family. So, I worry about newspapers, throwing themselves into running campaigns. Because if I like the campaign, that's great. If I don't like the campaign, I'm uncomfortable. Although I think that's also a concern of the past, because there's much more. That's not partisan. That's not a partisan campaign. It's an issue campaign, but it still is. Sometimes there is nuance that gets lost.
Right. I mean, I would think you have to choose those campaigns while you have to really feel that where your community is. But I think back to, it sort of ties into what Rose said about talking heads. There's so much of that in all types of media, like a campaign where you want one, where you kind of know how the outlet feels about something, or with cable news, there's these talking heads and you know how they feel. And I don't know if the public is always so aware of the difference between pure reporting and these talking heads that they see. So they watch Fox News and they think oh my God, this isn't real news, because they think Sean Hannity should be just telling the news straight, or they watch MSNBC and that's sort of another way. And so they say, oh, I like the news on MSNBC because that's how I feel.
Right,
and I don't like the news on Fox News, when they're not really watching
and I think
pure
if
news.
you notice, one thing that's happened with especially newspapers that have gone online is the opinion page is no longer section 2, 3, 4, 5. It's now on the front page. I mean, look at the New York Times. They have opinion columns on the first page.
Yeah, but they have it on the right side and they have the news on the left side.
But it's still the first thing you see.
There is a
If you're
structure.
It's not separated
if you're a person who, we're news people,
Yeah.
we notice those little
You're
subtle
reading it just
differences.
like you're reading everything else. As if
Yeah.
it
And
was
think
just
about
facts.
people who are getting their news through either feeds, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, where it's not arranged even on a home.
Well, I think that's a whole different issue. But go ahead, because the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the Twitters of the world are very different than what you're seeing in something like the newspaper. So let me not interrupt.
No, absolutely. And in terms of this is happening with adults. Imagine kids who are growing up with this in terms of the critical thinking, in terms of where they get their news from. And are they learning to trust brands, or are they learning to distrust brands because of what they hear around them, especially with what's going on with the cable news outlets?
Well, I think that, I've looked at, my kids are now 20 and almost 22, and they've been deeply affected. They're both girls. They've been deeply affected by what they see as this grotesque sexism coming out of the White, and it's politically activated them. My little one was at the March on Washington, and she goes to school in Baltimore, and but they go down to Washington all the time. So that's good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's a lot to improve about journalism today, and if we look back, even before, but just think about in your own lives, the stories that made you the stories that change your opinions about anything. Just try to think back to A, what was it, and B, where did it come from? What was the source of it? What was the brand that delivered it to you? There was a story I heard on an NPR podcast about adoptees. Adoptees who are of one race being adopted by parents of another race. And I got to tell you, the audio from that episode, literally brought me to tears. And it was a story that I would not have heard of if I had not trusted the brand of NPR and of the show and sort of went into that topic. But it is harder and harder to find stories that you trust, that people encounter stories that make them question previously held assumptions or beliefs, when a lot of information and stories are sort of launched into the stratosphere because you're no longer turning a page, because you're finding stories in clicks and feeds.
Which raises the question of what's called, and I still don't know what this is, interactive journalism. Is journalism not a one-way street? Is it now a two-way street?
I don't know.
I don't
You might
understand
know.
what it is, but I mean,
I feel
what
like
is it?
Jerry would
Yeah,
know.
well,
That's a Jerry question for sure.
I think it's absolutely a two-way street in the sense that we now have more ways to listen to people.
In terms of comments and stuff.
In terms of
Right.
comments, in terms of story ideas, in a lot of ways it's a beat reporter's dream, but it's all in the mix. You've got to be out there talking to people, but there are other ways to filter things in. I want to go back to Ozzy's point about the story that he was talking about at NPR. And the thing that strikes me about that is that there were people's voices in those
Yes.
stories, right? And we're not seeing enough people in the stories. Stories are about political fights, sometimes about policy, but ultimately they're not.
They're
not
horse
enough
race
time.
stories
Horse
instead of
race stories.
substantive stories.
Well, yeah, but I mean, ultimately, a lot of times we're not seeing the people in the stories who the stories are about or should be about. And I think that's another way that people are going to disconnect. They're going to react to that voice of that person, or the quotes that they're reading, or the faces that they're
And they
seeing.
can react to that in
And-
print as well. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
And we're saying that sitting in New York, where we have an enormous amount of press. It's not like the press has disappeared. We have WNYC, we have the Times, we have the Daily News, et cetera. But in the rest of the country, and particularly in some of these swing states, it's a news desert. People are looking at social media because that's all there is to look at. Newspapers have, stopped
I grew up with
publishing
7
print
papers.
editions.
Most cities have 1, and cities like New Orleans
And they're
don't
failing.
even have them every
Don't
day.
even have every day. Yeah,
And
you've
the
got-
other part of this too, we were talking about all going and covering community board meetings, which is how I cut my teeth too, working for local papers in Manhattan. And it used to be when I went to the community board meeting and somebody didn't like the story that I had written, they came up and they told me, they yelled at me. We shook
Yeah.
hands or whatever after. But when you have fewer reporters, you don't have that physical presence in the communities either. And that, again,
That also
Bigger
shields the
task.
reporters. It not only is there's a community, but that's a very valuable thing for a reporter to get that direct feedback. Because I've always thought that too many reporters spend too much time in the newsroom, as opposed to getting out there and letting people yell at you.
and that exacerbates the us versus them.
Yes,
And it's
yes.
also led to this environment where the media seems to have this sort of collective, like, oh, why did this happen? Every election is a big surprise to them because they weren't out there reporting on the people in these places.
Well,
you
this
know, it's
was-
sort of like, Donald Trump won. How the heck could we have missed it? Well, how come you didn't send more reporters to these states and interview the people on the ground who were supporting him and find out what was going on? What was this phenomenon?
So I used to teach covering local government and covering local politics up at Columbia, and my argument was always that politics is not. It's not like covering a fire where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's an ongoing. It's everything is incremental. Everything is shoving down the road. There are very few cataclysmic events. There are elections. There's money. I mean, I happen to think people pay too much attention to money in politics and not enough attention to issues in politics.
Right, and journalism, like many other fields, also I think has a problem of specialization. A lot of people feel like covering local issues is being parochial.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of people feel like going to Washington, D.C. and covering a president is more important than staying in New York City and covering a mayor or a community board. So you have this incentive sort of in the industry, very much like medicine, very much like policing, very much like other things where specialties are sort of favored rather than a general practice. So someone can be very well intentioned and want to cover diverse stories, want to do more than just whack-a-mole, want to do something service-oriented like street closures and stuff. They're incentivized because of their own ambition, because of their own hierarchy in the organization to sort of go further and further away from the sort of local grassroots reporting. And when they do it, it's often in terms of a big sweeping story rather than incremental everyday stories. And places like New York and California and Washington, D.C., where there's metropolitan areas that are thriving economically, draw more people away, and you have these sort of left behind places that Alec McGillis at ProPublica has done a magnificent job talking about, where these places are sort of left behind, there's less coverage and more content from non-professional journalists.
And their attention is being drawn by other
Exactly.
things. I mean,
Yes.
for all the time that a lot of the high-profile White House reporters spend tweeting, Facebooking, and appearing on television, I don't know how they have time to do any reporting. I mean, you just turn on CNN all day. It's like New York Times reporters, Daily News reporters.
pardon
You got
my-
everyone's on TV and everyone's.
I mean, following up on what Ozzy said, and pardon, this is a reflection of my politics. The fact that people are not covering all those things winds up with things being done by powerful people that are not to the advantage of the people, who will live in that community. That there's, that the function of journalism to, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable is not that there's a social cost to that not happening. So, sir, let me switch over to a question. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Good evening, Joseph Coburn, Baruch College. My question for you all is, we mentioned before that there's a tendency for social media outlets to kind of race to deliver news rather than deliver accurate news. And with President Trump's tendency to use Twitter to kind of just spark controversy rather than deliver the truth to American people, do you think that in the future presidents' use of Twitter should be limited to allow for accuracy in the news?
Unfortunately, I don't think you can limit anybody's use of Twitter. I think that's part of it, is that people are allowed to tell
The
lies.
damn First Amendment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, do you report those lies? And if you report those lies, do you call them out? Do you research what this person said? I don't think that, and again, I don't think that the media has to report everything. I mean, I'm a big believer in freedom of the press. I'm certainly not arguing for censorship or whatever, but I don't think that freedom of the press means that every single opinion has to be on TV every single day just because it was said. So, a bigot is a bigot. I don't think you have to put every bigot on
Well,
TV.
you have
I don't think
you have
put
an
every white
example.
nationalist on TV.
You have an example right now with the Guatemalan and Honduran
Absolutely.
caravan coming through Mexico, which. I think the president has, in some frankly typically racist ways, trying to suggest that these people are invading our country when they're 1,000 miles from the country. And on the one hand, people say, why are you covering them? On the other hand, that's not a reporter's job. That's a story. If you take away the bizarreness, in my view, of the president reaction and the kind of right-wing reaction, it still is a story of there's 1,000 people escaping, escaping what they're escaping in Guatemala and Honduras and heading to America. So how could you not cover something?
Yeah. The question about limiting a use of Twitter, I too am very reluctant to sort of wade in on a First Amendment issue. But if you look at the platform, there is no cost to tweet. There is no cost to like or retweet. It's free in essence because it's supported by advertising. In fact, Facebook is an advertising tool that we all just sort of populate and work for it in a sense. There are not many other platforms that you could use to amplify your voice that don't cost you anything. If you want to order a pizza, you pay for it. If you want to tweet, you don't. The cost is coming out at another end. Should social media platforms put some kind of speed bump or sort of regulate certain types of behavior or use?
Well, there's an attempt to do that now. There's an attempt on some
Right.
racist behavior, some lying behavior.
Right.
You see Facebook because of
Right.
doing that now,
You
trying to.
know, the phrase is, pay attention. If you think of paying attention as something that you have to pay for, people should, I think, sort of account for the time they spent on Twitter and sort of regulate it the way parents teach kids how to regulate TV time. Or if you think about the way you eat, you're supposed to have like a balanced meal. Well, are you getting a balanced meal if you're digesting so much social media, but you're not reading enough?
And at some point, consumers of news
Just
have to apply their own judgment.
Yeah.
One of the benefits in growing up with a multiplicity of news outlets, which, we did even in this city where you have 3 and 4 papers, which is a real luxury, or this multiplicity of now online sources, so you apply your own judgment. You read more than one, and you make up your own mind as to what makes sense and what doesn't.
Yeah, I
So
think-
some of this is on us. It's not, we shouldn't be passive consumers of news. So
I would agree.
Absolutely. Facebook and Twitter have a near impossible task if they're going to try to police the millions of tweets that
I'm
are
not
going
sure I
every
trust
day.
them to police what
Absolutely,
what
yeah.
I want to see. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jessica Sirico. I go to Hunter College. And given that there's such a wealth of information nowadays, what role do you all think that media literacy or lack thereof plays in this conversation?
Boy, that's an interesting question.
I think that's a really good question. I think because I worked at newspapers, I'm very aware of what I'm reading, and but I wonder what I would think, the things that I pick up on, I think that I don't know, like we were talking about the talking heads, I'm very aware of, all right, this is an opinion columnist, they're giving their version of the facts or their version, not that the facts are facts, but they're saying that the facts equal something. And so I don't necessarily, I'm very aware when it's an opinion thing. You know, I remember I saw someone tweeted, I read Peggy Noonan because I always look for other, you know, I think she's a good columnist.
She's a conservative columnist, very, very articulate.
And so I like her. So somebody, and I follow her on Twitter. And somebody tweeted to her, and she retweeted it, and she wrote, thank you. Someone tweeted, like, Peggy, I think you're the best journalist there is. You're such a fair voice, or something like that. And then Peggy wrote, thank you. And I do like Peggy Noonan, but I really wanted to say, like, Peggy,
You're very conservative.
you're not doing this person any good, because what you should be saying is, you like my stories because you agree with me. I am not a reporter. I am, you know, I write columns and my opinion's in here. Here's some great Wall Street Journal reporters for just straight news or something like that. And I just think media literacy, like, I don't know if people realize that, like, their favorite reporters aren't really reporters. They're like opinion people, or they're talking heads, you know. And
But that's the echo chamber. That's the silos.
Yeah, I mean, I think that media literacy has to start being taught at the grammar school level, third
It's
and fourth
civics.
grade.
It's basic civics.
It's intertwined with civics. I mean, I think it was Pew recently had a quiz, and there were statements, and you had to determine whether they were facts or whether they were opinion. And, you know, you're clicking on them, and you could also see which percentage of people got it wrong and got it right. And it was a shocking number that got it wrong.
Yeah, I think the worst thing that could happen is that our schools become echo chambers as well. You know, that we don't teach people to discern between fact and fiction, and that you have places like, you know, there was a whole issue in Texas of not teaching Hillary Clinton as part of the history curriculum and all.
Well, that's the politicization of, you
That's
know,
dangerous
elected
stuff.
school boards and stuff. Though I think that, you know, I was going to say that those are aberrations. Unfortunately, those aberrations are increasingly widespread. And we do live, I mean, New York is its own echo chamber. So, I mean, you know, let's not forget where it is that we live. You know, we do have, you know, I mean, even the New York Post, which I think is nowhere near the cartoon paper that people think it is. I think it's a much more responsible paper these days than, you know, people still have it stuck in the, you know, in the 1970s somewhere. And it's not. You know, I mean, their editorial page, I always say editorial page is the publisher's business. You buy a paper, you get a whole lot of debt, and you get an editorial page. I mean, that's not, if I had to pick my papers by the editorial page, I couldn't I'd have to open up my own paper. And I don't agree with myself all the time. So, but, you know, media literacy also means applying your judgment, you know, taking in as much as you can and deciding what makes sense to you. And we're not going to agree, but that's okay.
Judgment is an acquired thing.
Judgment is an acquired taste. Do you see any grounds? You know, there is a reaction to what's going on in Trump world with this feeling that things that, you know, that truth, you know, truth is a lot more fungible than it used to be. And is there a way to rebuild something where there's a common set of facts? Is there a way that at least we can fight over the common set of
Well, I
facts?
think you start in your coverage with Trump. I don't think that Trump tells a lie and doesn't know it's a lie. I don't think that he's
I don't think Trump cares, right?
I don't think he's
But
deluding
can we
himself. He's doing it on
find-
purpose because he knows we'll get the bait, you know?
But is there any way to find that common, you know, that we can at least agree to fight over things that we agree about?
Yeah, I mean, we have to believe that if we have any hope of going on in this business. And not only just
Not the
this
business, it's the country.
This country, this democracy. I think that I have to hope that when people see or hear reporting that is filled with facts, that's filled with differing viewpoints, that they're going to give that more credibility. And as Rose says, they're going to you know, make their own judgment at some point, but they need to be given the information to make their own judgment.
But there has to be a financially viable model that whoever or whatever is going to do that can make a living.
But I think the bar is higher now for media organizations that are making money. I expect more of network news and the New York Times and the Washington Post than I ever have. I mean, they are the ones that are left with the resources and left with the numbers of reporters. And I don't know if you saw the Melania Trump interview, for instance. I mean, you know, very interesting interview and everything, but the woman is a birther. He never even mentioned that. I mean, come on.
Let me take one last question. You can get another bite.
Yes, again, Joseph Colburn, Baruch College. I wanted to ask you guys one other question about particularly Matt Lauer with the Me Too movement. Do you think that, like, one person I mean, and there's been several reporters that were accused of sexual harassment, sexual assault. And do you think that those people kind of ruined the reputation of news reporters across the industry as these
Well, I don't know.
typical
I mean,
people rather than, neutral people trying to deliver the news?
I think they've certainly ruined their own reputation, but I mean, I don't know how to answer that.
I think the Me Too movement was such a reckoning of really that just touched on every single industry and really male abuses of power that had been around, that people just sort of accepted, and all of a sudden there was just like a groundswell of just like, no, we're not taking this anymore, and brave women stood up and talked about things that were old. So I don't think it really reflected poorly on journalism, more so than any other profession. It was so widespread. There was so much everywhere. That said, it really was, as somebody, I started, I was a reporter. I think I started the Post in 2001. And I think it still is. It's kind of a boys' club. There's a lot of, this stereotype of what a journalist is, this hard-drinking man who's like, or just that it's like not, the culture of journalism was very sort of, like a lot of things, I think it just
It was
was
it was left over from the 1950s.
It was left over from the
Right.
1950s. That's what people thought it was.
I do think, though, that it did expose a little of the media's hypocrisy and the way it deals with women. When you have like the fuzzy, wuzzy morning anchor, who's doing all these stories for what is predominantly a female viewership, and there are all these female-friendly stories, and the media does a lot of stories about discrimination and women in the workplace, and then you find out that the guy that's reporting it is actually a bit of a harasser himself.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like
it's
these
true.
people aren't real.
And the other thing is, these were the people that were covering Hillary Clinton, who was our
Absolutely.
first, female presidential candidate, and then some of the people that were doing sort of the most reporting on her were in their personal lives behaving terribly to women. So that was also, I think, something that really came to light that
And
was
these are-
important to know, really.
And these are the people that are criticizing President Trump for his behavior, and
Yeah.
President Clinton for his behavior, and here they are.
But you also see the coverage, that's an example. We're about to run out of time. That's, the coverage of the Matt Lauers and the Harvey Weinsteins shows how journalism can move a society to a better place. I'm getting the goodbye sign. I always make deadline. I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.